Welcome. As Jerry says, I'm the co-chair of the Spotlight on Science Committee. There's a number of us who contribute here, many of them in attendance. On our behalf, we'd like to welcome you all to the season finale of this year's second full season. And judging by tonight's attendance, we're doing pretty well. It looks like the Spotlight is a great addition to our already distinctive programs, and many of them were mentioned by Jerry. And these are really here to bring us together to hear the world's leading authors, artists, journalists, doctors, scientists, all on topics of interest and importance to our community here in Newport Beach. The objective of the Spotlight on Science is to convey both an understanding and appreciation of how and where basic research transforms our understanding of our universe, and quite often translates directly into groundbreaking, or some may say earth-shaking, impacts on our lives and communities. Sorry for the pun. Actually, I'm not sorry. Our opportunity and our challenge, of course, is to tell these stories through the eyes of the researchers themselves, and to select interesting topics with speakers who can simultaneously connect the dots and create inspiration in an understandable way. Our committee surveys themes ranging from the infinitesimal to the infinite, exploring the sciences of biology, chemistry, physics, optics, neuroscience, electronics, and the environment and cosmology. And our 5 broad topical categories include the human body, our planet, the worlds beyond Earth, energy and transportation, and emerging technologies. Earlier this season, we heard about the important role hydrogen will play in California's clean energy future, and just recently about how CRISPR technology is revolutionizing the study and manipulation of the human genome. Last season, we focused on artificial intelligence, both as a breakthrough technology and its impact on scientific research in tracking glaciers, water, coastal erosion, and flooding, all topics directly impacting our community here. Our inaugural explored the mysteries of the universe as seen from the James Webb Space Telescope, and tonight we welcome Dr. Lucy Jones to discuss California's tectonic activity. And next season, we'll continue with more phenomenal subjects and speakers, so we appreciate your enthusiastic attendance. As Jerry mentioned, Spotlight is one of the programs here that are sponsored by the Foundation. The Witty Lecture Series showcases distinguished speakers from all around the world. Library Live brings renowned authors for unforgettable conversations and storytelling. The Financial Literacy Workshops offer the latest insights on managing your finances and securing your estate. Medicine in Our Backyard showcases groundbreaking health and medical advancements, bringing expert insights straight to the community. And the book discussion group sparks engaging conversations on acclaimed and thought-provoking books. But the Foundation also supports the library with resources like the Media Lab, self-checkout computers, the Tech Toys, the Wayfinder, and the e-branch of digital resources. And because we cannot accomplish all of this without your support, here's why I ask for your money. We urge you to join or renew your membership, which benefits all Newport Beach families and our surrounding communities. I would like to note that the library has greater than 3 million patron visits per year, including online and in-house visits, and that makes us one of the most visited landmarks in the city, other than the beaches and probably Fashion Island over here. Finally, as you can see, these programs typically fill this room. We call it the Friends Room, to well past capacity. It limits occupancy, sight lines, and audio capabilities. So this is why the Foundation accepted the challenge to raise fully half the funds for a brand new state-of-the-art lecture hall and civic auditorium for the Newport Beach community. It's now called Witty Hall in recognition of a generous founding gift by Bill Witty and Keiko Sakamoto, and this will truly be a community-wide asset. It will support literary, cultural, artistic, educational, and even business events for years to come. As you can tell by the mess in the parking lot, the construction's now fully underway. However, commencing construction does not mean we've completed our fundraising. So we have made significant progress. We are on the hook for $12 million for this building, and our portion, the good news is we're around 11 million and some change at this point, but that does mean we have $1 million hole to fill. So I'm looking at all of you and asking you to join us in making this vision a reality. As part of the upgrades to the program, we'll have a much larger state-of-the-art video screen. We'll have a 300-seat auditorium, and we'll be able to add science and other feature films to our presentations in the future as well. I'd also like to point out that this library itself was built by such a partnership with the city 30 years ago, and it's the foundation in its founding to help raise the money. So please visit our website. There's probably a donation can in the back. Jerry Capel, who you just met, is our connection for talking more about the hall, and you can find us on the website. So enough of the preamble. I'd like to introduce you, please. That's going to be an exciting place. Okay. Now I'd like to introduce my co-conspirator and co-chair in Spotlight, Dr. Bruce Clark, who will introduce tonight's speaker. Bruce.
It's my great pleasure to introduce to you tonight our speaker, a professional colleague and friend of Karen and mine for more than 30 years, Lucy Jones, who has defined the role of the scientist in public service, and quote unquote, for our community. And she first started this process back in the probably early to mid 1980s, when she was working with the U.S. Geological Survey, and pretty soon became the informal head of the public communications arm of the survey. Partly because a lot of other survey members either didn't want to or weren't capable of communicating with the public. Over the years, we got to know her from her iconic television appearances after several large earthquakes here in Southern California. And after the 1992 Joshua Tree earthquake, you may recall, she appeared late at night with her baby son on her shoulder, and with no problems proceeded to explain just what had happened and why to all of her Southern California colleagues. Lucy wasn't always destined to be a science communicator. She was born in China to missionary parents, and she completed her undergraduate studies at Brown University in Chinese language and literature in the mid-1970s. But then she moved on to MIT almost immediately to do a PhD in geophysics. So something was going on behind the scenes, and I think maybe she was taking a bunch of math and physics courses at Brown and doing quite well in them. She moved on after her PhD with the early career with the U.S. Geological Survey as a research seismologist, where she established her scientific credentials studying foreshocks before large earthquakes. Foreshocks had been allegedly used to predict, quote unquote, the magnitude 7.5 Haicheng earthquake in China in 1975. Some of you may remember this was a big story at the time. But a few months later, an even larger earthquake occurred very nearby in China. The Tangshan earthquake had no foreshocks that we detected ahead of time, and that quake killed 240,000 people. A reliable earthquake prediction still eludes us today, but we're doing a lot of thinking about it, and we're trying to explain to people what we know and what we don't know. And that's what we're going to have Lucy tell us a little bit about tonight. In addition to her scientific credentials, Lucy is a talented musician. She plays the viola da gamba with the Los Angeles Baroque, our community Baroque chamber orchestra. Lately, she's created musical pieces using historical data on things like global warming and the temperature changes that have occurred over the last 100 years or so as the basis for her musical compositions. Unfortunately for you, she will not be playing her viola da gamba tonight. Instead, she'll be talking about earthquakes and maybe some other natural disasters and how we can deal with them more effectively. So please join me in welcoming Lucy Jones.
I have a feeling if we'd advertised this as a viola da gamba concert, we would have had a lot fewer people coming to show up. You know, we're thrilled when we get 50 people. Okay. So I am here to talk to you about earthquake risk and natural hazards in Southern California and how we can deal with them. You guys made it really easy by having an earthquake. I think many of you saw this, right? So just a couple of weeks ago, I intentionally don't have the sound. We really don't want to listen to her. But I thought I'd make the point of really looking at what it was that those animals did and how they responded by instinct. I think it's really just so cool and so impressive that they went. And I know that when I was experiencing significant earthquakes with young children, I protected my children, right? And there they are, doing what works well by instinct. I will say that we have an instinctual approach to risk. We have an analytical approach. The analytical approach usually gives us a better answer. We also want to go run outside. Probably not the right thing to do. We actually teach people to do drop, cover, hold on. I taught this to my children. I'm now teaching it to my grandchildren. I had to throw this in. And when the earthquake happened and they're in Irvine, they properly did the drop and cover. And in fact, my grandson yelled out, "And hold on," right? So we know what to do. But emotionally, that's not what we would do, right? To learn to do this, you really have to teach them. And that's a lot of what I'm going to be doing here today, is giving you some of the analytical side. So when you're afraid of the next earthquake or enjoying the next earthquake, you can have some context within which to look at it. Right? I'm going to start with a pretty basic idea of what's an earthquake. It is the slip of one block of rock past another that produces shaking as one of its effects. And that's the way a scientist defines it. Most of you probably think of it as the shaking, right? But the causal event is the slip of a fault, just like we're seeing here on the right. This is a picture from the Kobe earthquake in 1995. They did not plant their rice paddy with this offset. During the earthquake, the fault moved from a distance of about 6 feet, right? During the event, along a whole fault surface. Right? And this is the cause of the earthquakes. This is the part that can't be stopped. This is plate tectonics in action. Right? As long as it's a big enough earthquake and you get the fault up to the surface, that you can see it in a lot of places. It can be very large. This is from the magnitude 7.9 Kaikoura earthquake in New Zealand. Right? And in fact, the length of the fault that moves in the earthquake is what determines the magnitude. So if we look at here's the length of the fault in kilometers versus the magnitude. The magnitude 5.2 we just had in Julian is probably about 2 kilometers across, maybe a mile. If it was only this room, it would have only been a magnitude 4, right, or even a 3-something, right? But to be the 1906 earthquake 7.8 in Northern California, you've got to be 400 kilometers long. Right? And so when those big earthquakes happen, you affect a much larger area. Now, we've all heard magnitude, right? That's what we all talk about. 5.2 for this earthquake, or 6 here, or 7 there, 7.7 that just happened in Myanmar. But what you feel is something different. And we use an intensity scale that also uses numbers. But we use Roman numerals to differentiate from intensity 1 means it's not felt, to intensity 10 that really most masonry and frame structures are destroyed, railways are bent, really extensive destruction. And as a comparison, here is what's called a shake map for the Myanmar earthquake. So the shake map plots out what level of intensity was actually received at these different sites. So their largest city is Yangon, down here, and it was receiving intensity 6 to 7, right? Very bad buildings will be damaged, and even some moderately, plaster structures and such could be collapsed. But if you get into their second largest city of Mandalay, there it's intensity 9, and that's a level at which, remember, not magnitude, intensity, but intensity 9 is where we see collapse of modern structures. And in fact, if we, just to give you context on it, here's the Northridge earthquake. So all those pictures we saw of really badly damaged buildings, those were all in intensity 9 areas. We all felt it. We all felt we were part of it. But if you weren't in the northwest San Fernando Valley, you really didn't have that earthquake, right? And there was a pocket of damage down in Santa Monica, right? So you can see it's going into 7 to 8. There were some pockets of 8 down here in Santa Monica. But we were in Pasadena, which is over, these are faults, not freeways, so I have to think about it for a moment. Or right in here, right? And it was intensity 6. I mean, it woke me up. I really noticed it was going on. I could see the flashing lights from the transformers on the electric poles. But we had, the only thing that fell down was a stack of magazines on which we'd put a record player because we were no longer using it. CDs had come in and we hadn't figured out what we were doing with our record player. That's the sole thing to fall down in our house. So yes, I felt the earthquake, but I didn't have, it wasn't really in the earthquake. Right? So I can't tell you how often I've heard somebody say, my house must be okay. Think of all the earthquakes I've been through. I went through Northridge, no problems. You live in La Mirada. Seriously, somebody in La Mirada said that to me. And for those of you here in Orange County, sorry, you guys haven't had it, right? All right, 33, we had the earthquake here in Long Beach, and it came down to Huntington Beach, I think. It got down to about here. So that would have been the strongest shaking you had, but there wasn't very much here in 1933, right? If we use the same sort of picture to look at the earthquake that just happened, so here's the earthquake that you guys just experienced. Notice that it's by this pretty long mapped fault. This is called the Elsinore Fault. The stars are other magnitude 5s in the California catalog, so I think it goes back about 100 years. And they're all at least magnitude 5. So Imperial Valley, way more than anybody else. The San Jacinto Fault is pretty active. The Elsinore Fault has historically really been quite inactive, but we can see in the geology that it has to have earthquakes. And in fact, what are called paleoseismologists, the type of work that actually Bruce spent a chunk of his career doing, going in and looking in fault in detail. If you talk to me, I'm a seismologist. I look at waves. I look at seismograms. The geologists have to take me out and go, this is a fault. And I go, oh, okay, right? But get Bruce if you really want to know what's going on here. But when we go into those faults, we can see that the Elsinore Fault averages big earthquakes every 500 to 1,000 years. So there will be bigger earthquakes, right? And it's a long fault, and it's a pretty straight fault. So if you raptured from this earthquake here, this was in 2010, the El Mayor Cucapal earthquake that happened on Easter Day. It's down here in the Mexican border, ruptured right up to the Mexican border and then stopped, which was like, wow, I didn't know that Border Patrol did that well. If you took it from here all the way up here, that would be about a 7.5. It's probably the worst earthquake we could have in Los Angeles, because especially if you start here in the south and rupture to the north, we'd help focus energy in. By comparison, the earthquake that we just had, here's the shake map. You got up to a little tiny bit of intensity 6 if you were right there in Julian, right? Up here in Orange County, you're looking at intensity 3 to 4. Right? You all felt it, but it really didn't do anything. Mm-hmm. And just to remind you of the comparison, here's the Mandalay earthquake again. Right? On a pretty different scale, too. This is about 450 kilometers long, the fault itself. Right? We have tried to figure out what that means for us if we were to have a big earthquake. So we made a model of what we think could happen on the San Andreas. Are we going to get started here? Oh, it doesn't want to. Did I not load my? Well, it looks like I didn't load my movie properly somehow. We'll skip that then. We have looked at what we think would happen with a really big San Andreas earthquake. Right? We did 300 kilometers long. That means it's going to take about 100 seconds for the earthquake to happen because it starts at one end and ruptures up the fault at a speed of about 3 kilometers or about 2 miles per second. So, this magnitude 5, 2-mile fault. So it lasted, the actual production of energy in the earth was a second or two, and you felt it for a few seconds, right? Northridge was 7 seconds. The 1906 earthquake, we think, was about 100 to 150 seconds. Right? And so if we have a big San Andreas earthquake, so if I always start counting. The minute I start feeling an earthquake, I start counting. So in 92, when the 7.3 happened in Landers, and I woke up, started counting. Actually, I was awake because I had a baby. And I got to 30 seconds. So I knew it was above magnitude 7 before I got out of bed. Couldn't tell much more than that because we didn't have all our automatic systems then. I will say that a reporter from the Orange County Register called me really before my bed had stopped moving and asked me had my home phone number, which was disturbing, and asked me what it was. I was like, how do you think we do this, Gary? I'm still in bed, right? Haven't looked at a record yet. Now, of course, we all get it automatically, and you can all get it automatically. And if you're interested in it, you can go to the earthquake notification system with the U.S. Geological Survey and get emails or texts if you're really crazy. And you get to define what level you want to see it and where in the world. You can see I actually get emails for every earthquake above 5 in the world and average several a day. Right? So there's what we have here. That's what the earthquakes are. What's our risk from them? And I actually came up with a pseudo equation of what our risk would be. That it's a combination of the hazard, which means what's the earth doing to us? That's the faults, that's the potential for liquefaction, that's all of that motion that you can't stop. Or, if it's a different hazard, it would be volcanoes or, the wildfire, the brush distribution for wildfires, right? The exposure being, who have we exposed to this hazard? What people have we been putting in harm's way? And how fragile is the system that we've built? You put those together, and that's increasing your risk. You can actually reduce it, that's why I have a division in here, by a really good response. Right? Now, this tends to be what we do really well. But, if we respond really well, we can stop some of the fires that are being triggered by the earthquake. And we'll actually be reducing losses. Taking people out of downed buildings. And then I ended up adding one more thing that I call the will to recover. Because recovery is often worse than the disaster itself. The time, the disruption of our communities. I heard we live in Pasadena. We just watched 6,000 of our neighbors lose their homes. Right? And it's going to be a long road to recovery, and how much we can work together is a really big part of what that is. So let's go back and look at each of these pieces, and I'll spend a time, since I am the earth scientist, on the hazard. Right? What's the hazard that we have here in California? The fundamental issue is that we are on a plate boundary. I'm going to assume that we all know what plate tectonics is, even if it wasn't taught when many of us were in high school. Most of us have heard about it and know what it is. The San Andreas Fault is the surface representation of much of that motion, but not all of it. We can tell from measurements with GPS how fast, geodetic measurements, how fast is the Pacific plate moving past the North American plate. And it works out at a little over 5 centimeters a year. Mm-hmm. And of that, about 3.5 centimeters, 35 millimeters, happens on the San Andreas Fault itself, at least up in this part of the fault. When you get down here into Southern California, it actually splits off, and it's only about 20 or 25. The rest of it is happening on other faults. And we are particularly at risk from this problem here in Southern California because we have a bend in the San Andreas Fault. We're really imaginative. We call it the Big Bend. And you've actually got an offset of just about 100 miles. You've got this fault, this part of the San Andreas moving, running northwest, and this part's running northwest, and they're offset by about 100 miles. Right? This is a problem when the plates keep on moving. All right? So we are now bringing material up. I mean, when we think about it, we actually think about how do you move that material around? One thing about geologists, we think in really different time scales. We call 10,000 years recent, right? And that's an important, that's the definition of a really active fault. So, over millions of years, we are moving this material up here, and it's now running into the material here because it's the other side of the fault. So there's a couple of things that are happening. The San Andreas Fault down here is starting to break up and move over onto these parallel faults because that'll cut off, eventually this piece of land that is now part of the Pacific Plate will end up as part of the North American Plate, and the plate boundary will have jumped over to the San Jacinto Fault. Right? It's happening now. Right? Now, as in, like, the San Jacinto Fault is really, really young. It's only 750,000 years old, right? Which means it's still forming. Right? The Elsinore Fault is actually older, and it's also taking about 5 millimeters a year of that motion. Remember, right? So it's picking up about 10% of the plate boundary motion. And it's of particular interest here, because it does run right up here. I actually didn't put on this. The Newport Inglewood Fault is another part of the system. It only moves at about 1 millimeter a year, so it's getting just a tiny percentage of it left. But this is all happening because we've got to get around this really big bend. It also creates lots of faults to push up those mountains because they're running into each other. So another way of looking at the faults in Southern California is this. And you notice that they're no longer lines, because actually faults aren't lines, they're surfaces. And if it's a vertical surface, it shows up on the Earth's surface as a line, but many of them aren't vertical, and many of them dip. And so then they're being shown here with these rectangles or other sorts of surfaces, that every point here is on top of this fault, because it's dipping out like this. Okay? And you notice that up in our neck of the woods, up around Pasadena, and then up to Santa Barbara, look at that mess of faults. Right? That is getting around the corner of the Big Bend. Right? You guys pick up a bit of it down here. There's something that's called the San Joaquin Buried Thrust, and that's coming in here. We still are arguing about exactly where it is, so this, it depends on which geologist makes the map exactly what shows up here. But there's some systems that are going on within this, but your main one is the Newport Inglewood. So you have less risk than we do in the northern part of the basin. It doesn't mean you have no risk. Right? In fact, let's imagine we looked at this risk like with color scale for anywhere else in the country, you guys would show up towards the top. So, all right, these are the faults. We can now say for each of these faults, how often do they move? And how big are the earthquakes? We guess. We're approximating. We're looking at the length of the fault and guessing how often it goes as a piece and how much it goes together. And we have fancy logic trees and expert models to explain why we're guessing. But, and logic trees tend to give you a pretty good answer as you average over all of your experts and the various guesses that go through. And you can then come up and say, how often are you likely to get strong shaking from whichever one of these faults? And that's this map. It tends to get around. You will see it's called a seismic hazard map. This is a public version, so we sort of gave up and just put low to high and didn't try to actually give numbers because whatever. And you can see Orange County is not as dark a color as northern LA, but compare it to just about anywhere else, and you're going to still be pretty high. Right? There is the Newport Inglewood Fault runs down along the coast here. It actually runs all the way down into San Diego and runs through like the San Diego City Hall. Or I guess it's the police department that's sitting on the fault. Yeah. So they can look and say, hey, look, we're not as dangerous as LA. And that's right. On the long-term average, they won't have as many. Which one happens in the next century is a random subset of this group. And once there is a earthquake that goes along the Rose Canyon, Newport Inglewood Fault, San Diego's going to regret saying this. Right? So, we publish these maps because we can. We do a lot of work. These are very important for creating building codes, right? How much shaking do you have to take into account? I will just say, take it with a really big grain of salt because we don't know which one's coming next. Mm-hmm. So that's hazard. Now there's, oh wait, why did that go? I guess I must have, excuse me. Is it going to just come on its own? No. Exposure is the next piece of it. And To what degree we've put people on top of it. Now, there's one level at which I just say, this is too late to even talk about this. We've already built our cities. Right? I'm not getting LA to disappear. But you might imagine, let's get the people out before the earthquake. And we'd still lose all those buildings, but maybe we'd save a lot of lives, i.e., don't we want earthquake prediction? And you heard from Bruce. I've got to say, I actually was a physics major in college up until the last semester. But I spent my junior year abroad in Taipei, because where I'd been with family. And so I had so many Chinese courses that when I decided to switch from physics to geophysics, I got to take the Chinese degree, and then I didn't have to take advanced electromagnetics and could take structural geology instead. So I was a physics major up until the last minute, right? But when I then showed up at MIT, and I happen to be fluent in Chinese, and I'm a physicist, and they're like, let's get you studying foreshocks. There was just this earthquake in China with over 500 foreshocks, and it looks like it's been predicted. And then if China ever opens up, this is 1976, before Mao died, we could send you to China. And it worked. And I went over and I got to spend 12 months in China as part of my PhD work and studied a lot about what was going on in this foreshock. So I dedicated my life to saying I was going to, predict earthquakes and save those of us unfortunate enough as to live near the San Andreas Fault. It's turned out to have a lot of problems, right? So what are the problems? One of the biggest ones is we need to predict the magnitude of an event. You don't want to be predicting every earthquake. There's going to be 50 today in Southern California, at least, right? You want to predict the one that's large enough to actually do some damage. So we're trying to predict the magnitude of the event. Remember, I told you the magnitude is the length of the fault that moves in the earthquake. So we've got to predict how it starts, but also how it stops. When we look at data from a lot of different earthquakes, I'm really not going to do much of this to you, but I got to put in a couple of good slides, right? Here's time during the earthquake, and here's the amount of energy, the moment rate, the amount of energy per second being released as you go through the earthquake. Look at this. And this is all sorts of different earthquakes, from 7 up to close to 9. They all start the same way. The smaller ones start turning over. The bigger ones keep on going, and then they turn over, and the biggest ones go even farther, and then they turn over. So, and then when you try to normalize it against the time, they all just land up on top of each other. So as far as we can tell, they all start the same way. And this sort of implies that the magnitude is actually determined during the earthquake and not before. If that's true, prediction is impossible. I'm still saying if. We're still arguing over this stuff. We're still looking for those patterns. So, but maybe there's one piece of information. If you go look at the San Andreas Fault, you don't get little earthquakes. You only get big ones. It's like the earthquake it's like the fault is so weak, it's been ground so smooth from so many earthquakes that once an earthquake gets started, there's nothing to stop it. So it always grows into a big earthquake. So maybe we can use that. Maybe we can go in and say, what's the time since the last earthquake? And we can go in and figure out when the next one's going to be, right? So we've got to look for that data, right? We only have one earthquake in the historic record, but those lovely geologists who like to climb into a hole in the ground and spend 6 months mapping the side of the hole, it's called paleoseismology, can get to the earthquake history by the actual layers within the fault that have been offset in different earthquakes and dating those. And you spend a year to get 2 data points. It's really I wouldn't be able to do that field, let's put it that way, right? But luckily there are others who do it. Here's an example of the data. This is probably the best one we've got. It's from Fraser Park, so up near, actually the northern end of the Big Bend, right? So it's right about where it's turning up here. And dug into it and we're able to get 11 events. And so we've got 10 intervals. And if you see the size of those intervals, right, we've got 3 of them that happen less than 50 years apart. We have one pair that was 350 years apart. Okay. And actually, it's only 10 data points, so in fact, our fit isn't, it's hard to get a really good fit with it. But the best fit to this is actually a Poissonian distribution, also called a memoryless distribution. The time since the last event doesn't matter. So, yeah, now you understand why we say prediction's so difficult? As far as we can tell, there's like every year has a 1% chance of having an earthquake. It is about 1 every 100 years, and it's been 350 years on the southernmost part of the fault. But it isn't clear that that's made it any more likely to happen. When we do those expert tree models, there's a lot of people who don't want to give this up, so I think it puts in as like 2% a year instead of 1% a year. Right? You might then really try to say, why doesn't this matter? And we actually, in the time of my career, we've actually come up with this stuff. Back when I was in graduate school, I actually did work in a rock mechanics laboratory. We took a rock, we put a fault through it, we sliced it, we put actually some gouge, some ground up rock in there. We squeezed it, right? Because when an earthquake begins 10 kilometers below the surface of the earth, there's the weight of 10 kilometers of rock pushing on that fault. So it's under a lot of pressure. And then we pushed on it till it broke. And we got data something like this, where with the amount of, the strength of rocks, you'd push and push and push, and you'd hit somewhere in the strength, and it would fall down, and you could keep on doing this. But if this was happening in the Earth, we would be having stresses around 200 megapascals, 2,000 atmospheres there at 10 kilometers depth. And if we were pushing on rocks at that pressure, we'd be melting them. Think about it. Take your hands, push them together, do it really lightly, and you go past. Now push together really hard. You get some skin coming off, but you also feel the heat, right? When you move under pressure, you generate heat. And we can calculate how much heat should be coming out of there. And we can measure the heat that's coming out of the fault. And when we do that, we get this. We know that the limit of heat flow means that we're moving down in this stress level and not at this stress level. While we know that we also have all the weight of that rock. Right? So how does this happen? What we actually think is going on is that some place, little tiny place on the fault, does get, because it's got an asperity, it's got some irregularities, it will hit that high stress level. But then once it starts moving, then you're not applying these sort of stresses. Then what's called dynamic friction is much, much lower. So we have to hit that strength somewhere. But then once it gets going, it never produces a little earthquake, it just grows on up into the big ones. Right? And so the timing is the distribution of those heterogeneities, not the time since the last earthquake. So once we started putting this together, and we know we have to be having earthquakes at what we would call low stress, actually, you don't expect it to have the time since the last earthquake really matter once you're moving down there. So here's our problems with prediction, right? There's a lot of reasons to realize why it doesn't work. There's an interesting phenomenon, though, is that seismologists want prediction. We all want prediction, right? That's what human beings do. We like patterns. We love to make patterns, and we want to believe our patterns. So we start getting in there, and we do all this modeling of it. You know, there's a paper written in 1915 by a famous seismologist named Harry Wood, arguing to create the first seismic network in Southern California, because when we know where the little earthquakes are, we're going to figure out where the big earthquakes are. It got difficult enough that Charlie Richter, a few decades later, then called anyone who tried to predict earthquakes either a charlatan or a fool. But then this Chinese stuff came up in the 70s, and it started looking like maybe it was really going on. And we started having people, very famous guy who ended up as head of the National Academy of Sciences, at Congress saying, we will be predicting earthquakes within 10 years. Frank Press, for those of you who know who that is. And And that was when I got into graduate school, and I went off to China and do this, and I discovered that really, they didn't really predict the earthquake. There were all these foreshocks, and people got scared, and in some places, everyone went outside just because there were a lot of earthquakes, right? And it was claimed as a great success because Mao's nephew was on the political committee there. I didn't know that part until quite a few years later. But I ended up realizing that, you know, we don't have that situation. So, and so we all went against, I mean, both my husband and I did earthquake prediction work for our thesis. And as it looked more and more difficult, we sort of went, you didn't say it's stupid, but you sort of move your way into some other work. And I moved into probabilities because there was the one thing that we really could try and quantify. Right? It's interesting, it's sort of coming back again. It's sort of been another 50 years. We're starting to see people talking about prediction again. I don't think it's going to turn out any differently this time. But, you know, so I want to point out, though, that we actually do predict a lot. We very successfully predict where the earthquakes will happen. We understand faults, and we understand how they play out into the long-term pattern. We successfully predict what will happen from them. What's that distribution of ground motions? I mean, I gave you intensities here. We also describe it in a variety of ways, and those are the calculations that go into designing buildings, and we get that really pretty well. We can tell you what the impacts are. You know, not just on the buildings, but also on lifelines and social systems. And you could argue we do successfully predict the time distribution. We've predicted that it's random. Okay? Okay. However, with one exception, and that's sort of my own research, plus aftershocks. Aftershocks are the only earthquakes that happen when we expect them. Right? When one earthquake happens, more earthquakes become more likely. And in fact, get back to the Julian earthquake. Having this earthquake has made the talk easier to put together, I will say. Okay? Here are the sequences that happen within the Julian earthquake. So the main shock is right here. Right? Here's magnitude versus time before and after magnitude 5.2. There was a 3.3 aftershock, foreshock. Right? So the day before, there was a 3.3 with a bunch of little ones. And then one of its aftershocks was bigger than itself. And you had a 5.2. Right? And then you see the same sort of, they die off with time. Now, a lot of people look at this and go, oh, the time and magnitude die off with time. And that's actually, the number and magnitude die off with time. And that's actually not true. Only the number dies off with time. The relative number of large to small is a constant. It's for every magnitude 5, we're going to have 10 4s, 100 3s, 1,000 2s, 10,000 1s. It's called a self-similar distribution. Right? And so one thing is you can't get rid of a 7 by having lots of 5s. Doesn't work. Having lots of 5 means you sort of need another 7 in there to keep that distribution about the same. Right? When they become less frequent, then you also tend to see only the smaller magnitudes because you got a lot more 2s available than you do the larger ones. So this pattern that one earthquake makes another more likely, mostly smaller, but about 5% of the time it gets bigger than the first one. Right? And there's lots of magnitude 3s. So, you know, a very small number of magnitude 3s are followed by a 5. Remember, there's 100 times as many 3s as there are 5s. Then a pretty large percentage of 5s are preceded by that 3. And that was actually that was the foreshocks we saw in China. That was work I did for decades, trying to find something that was different about foreshocks. Foreshocks are main shocks that happen to have a big aftershock. And in decades of research, we never found anything that makes them no discriminating characteristic. Sort of frustrating. Put a lot of my life into that. Never found an answer. So this was, I want to bring up one last thing. Remember, this topic was under getting away from the exposure. There's one other piece to get away from the exposure, and that's the fact that earthquake, when the rupture does come through to the surface, you can't stop it. This is what happened in the Silmar earthquake when the fault came through this house. Okay? And because of that, there was a state law that was then passed prohibiting building across an active fault. Right? It's called the Alquist-Priolo Act. It's been work for quite a few geologists to make sure you map out, figure out exactly where the fault is, because that's actually not that easy to say, right? After the earthquake, it's easy, right? Before the earthquake, you go, well, I can see it down here, and I can see it up here, and I know it's somewhere in between, but maybe it got covered by a stream bed. Maybe some, a landslide happened over it. Or we've gone and built a bunch of houses over it, and we bulldozed it before we put those houses in, right? So the law applies. You have to be an active fault. And remember I said 10,000 years is recent? That's our definition. It has to have moved technically within the last 11,000 years. And you also have to be able to define it at the surface. And sometimes you can and sometimes you can't. Right? But it's the one place where we can move away from this particular risk. Because this is one you can't stop. No matter how well built your building is, you don't stop the fault from moving. Right? But other than that, mostly of the rest of it isn't going to work. So let's move on to fragility. Because as long as the fault isn't rupturing straight through the building, we actually can build buildings that don't fall down. We just generally haven't chosen to do that. Mm-hmm. I'm going to start by saying we really could. If you look at Japan, you remember the magnitude 9 they had a little over a decade ago? Located right off, the epicenter is there. You can see where all the deep red is, that in fact the fault went most of the northern half of the island of Honshu. But right there, straight across from the epicenter, is a very large city of Sendai. I think it's about 5 million people. And this is what it looked like after the earthquake. It's fine. The damage was almost all from the tsunami. So if you choose to build strongly, you can. It's a cultural difference in Japan. If you're an engineer in Japan and one of your buildings is damaged, and they also have 3 times as many earthquakes as we do, so it's more likely to happen, you lose face. Nobody's going to come to your firm again. So they have this strong cultural thing, not just to fulfill the law, but to make sure they don't look bad. Okay? In Chile, they do it a little differently. If you've built a building within the last decade and it's damaged in an earthquake, you're liable. Unless you can prove that you absolutely completely match the building code, which is pretty hard to do afterwards. So owners, the engineers will say, you could build it this way. And they're like, I don't think I want to take the risk. And they had a magnitude 8.8 and one engineered building came down, only one. That's not the way the system works here in California. If you get your building past the building official, you're home free. You have no responsibility or liability after that. Now, there's quite a few reasons that your buildings might collapse. One is corruption. This is a picture from Turkey. And when that earthquake happened, everybody was talking about how corruption, right? Believing it's their corruption makes you feel safe, because that's their problem and I don't think I have it. Number one, we have corruption. We did have an LA City councilman go to jail for taking a bribe from a developer in cash in a Las Vegas bathroom, right? There is no question we've had corruption. But also, believing that we can just write off when we see extensive damage in a different country because it's their corruption problem is a way of not facing our own issues, whether or not there's a problem with the code. Other reasons a building might come down is that it is built before the current code. And this is a really big issue for us. Every earthquake, we go, ooh, wow, that wasn't a good idea, was it? Let's take it, we won't do that anymore. And in fact, we have quite a few types of buildings in California. We have the soft first story buildings. That's up here on the right, the Northridge Meadows apartments. That's where the first floor is weaker than the floors above it, so it concentrates the damage into that first floor, and then you can collapse onto it. Go to the older ones. We've got the unreinforced masonry. That's when the building is built and a brick wall is what's holding up the roof. Right? Brick, you shake a building, you shake brick, the mortar dissolves, the brick comes down, the roof comes down on top of you, you kill a lot of people. When I'm really feeling snarky, instead of URMs, which is what the engineers call them, unreinforced masonry, I call them FPRs for future piles of rubble. We haven't allowed them to be built since 1935. Most communities in 2/3 of the jurisdictions in Southern California have mandated retrofit of those buildings. The others have retrofit programs, but they're voluntary, which means mostly it doesn't happen. Newport Beach is luckily new enough that I don't think there are buildings here from before 1935, right? So I don't think it's a particular issue. Places like Pasadena or Los Angeles, it's a much bigger issue. Your bigger problem is going to be buildings like this, which is a steel moment frame building. And in the 94 earthquake, we discovered how much the welds were impairing the way in which the welds were done had changed the chemical response of the steel, and it no longer behaved ductily. The welds broke brittlely, and then once you had a crack, it propagated into the rest of the building. We've seen complete collapse of floors in Japan, and also somewhat with us. And then, of course, we have what's the famous non-ductile reinforced concrete buildings, which is the collapse of the Olive View Hospital in 1971. Again, we haven't built these buildings since they've changed in the 1976 building code, but a lot of Southern California was built before 1976, and those buildings are probably our most dangerous. When we do models, they're the ones that kill people. We have a variety. I don't know of any jurisdictions in Orange County to adopt mandatory retrofit of any other building besides the unreinforced masonry. In Los Angeles County have moved to do it. Los Angeles City undertook it. On these type of softer story buildings, we have retrofit in about a dozen communities, including Torrance, Pasadena, West Hollywood, Malibu, Santa Monica. I forget the others at this point. And Los Angeles. But that's something where we could make a big difference by doing that. But it's not the only way. It's not only older buildings that'll come down. You might have ground shaking that exceeds what the code says. See, the code's actually is designed to let you build the weakest building possible without falling down. One engineer I know compared it to being like a termite. And ideally, whatever is the most, they define the level of shaking you have a 2% chance of receiving in 50 years, that level of shaking will push your buildings right to the edge, and you have less than a 10% chance of collapsing in that earthquake. Actually, I think it's even higher. Yeah, no, it's 10% chance of collapsing from that earthquake. And if everybody did their job perfectly, you'd have the same chance of falling down in an earthquake everywhere. Because we have a higher level of shaking in northern Los Angeles County, we have to build buildings stronger than you do in Orange County. Right? Which also means we know how much it costs to build stronger. And it's not very much. I'll get to that. Because our current code standard literally allows collapse. When we say what we have as our code principle, a 99% probability to not collapse in a 50-year window. Because we somehow believe that all buildings disappear after 50 years. That's our defined life of a building. Right? And then we say 99% chance that you don't collapse in that. But remember random chance who gets the earthquake when? You get your 1 in 500 year event to have a less than a 10% chance of collapsing. That actually means we accept up to 10% of modern 2 code buildings collapsing in that worst shaking. And what we're trying to do is to minimize life loss while minimizing upfront costs. We don't say minimize the lifetime cost of the building, we say minimize the upfront cost to the developers. And that an engineer is taught that building any better than that would be wasting the client's money. In fact, building it to a standard that it's repairable, that it almost certainly doesn't collapse and doesn't have such bad damage that you can't repair it, estimates are it adds about 1% to the cost of construction. Yeah, we aren't saving a lot of money because of this. Right? And we've looked at it actually for the shakeout earthquake. When we went and modeled what a big San Andreas earthquake was, the movie I didn't get running earlier, we actually estimate that in downtown Los Angeles, 1% of the new buildings will collapse, and 10% will be red tagged, have to be torn down. And another 40% will have limited use, which means half of our buildings are not going to be usable. Half of our new buildings are not going to be usable after the earthquake. And this might seem like crazy that this is actually what we've done, But if we looked at a city that's gone through it, Christchurch, New Zealand, this is what it looked like in 2010, 450,000 people live in Christchurch. They had a magnitude 6.2. It wasn't that large, but it was literally down through the center of the city. You can sort of see the fault there, right? As all the dust comes up during the earthquake, whoever the lucky person was who was able to take this picture. They did have 2 collapsed buildings. They were the known problems, the non-ductile reinforced concrete. So no modern building collapsed in the earthquake. They did their job. This is what it looked like a few years later after 1,800 buildings had to be torn down and thrown away because they were so badly damaged they couldn't be repaired. Okay. So no, we didn't kill anybody with a modern building. We did our job as we've been asked to do it. But it's financially devastating to the city. They've gotten through it because they had over 90% insurance coverage. I don't know, how many people in this room have earthquake insurance? Anybody want to? That's a large number. You must have lower rates than we have up in Pasadena too. But that's high for around here. And we really don't, we aren't going to see the financial influx that they got in Christchurch to rebuild their city. So, the limits to fragility. We have a very big issue. I would like to see us move to that, add that 1% to the cost of construction and move on. We have twice tried to get it through the legislature. In 2018, we got it all the way through the legislature and it was vetoed by Governor Brown. In 22, somewhere around there, we got it through, almost all the way through, and it was stopped in the Senate Appropriations Committee. I did actually go and dig and try to figure out why, and I was told it was basically a political payback against the sponsor of the bill and had nothing to do with the bill itself. It was like a punishment for something else that had happened. At some point, we'll try again, but it's an uphill road. So let's remember, response, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this because this is probably something that America does very, very well. And in most places, emotionally, we are engaged when the disaster happens, and everybody supports their firemen, and it's just much harder to get support for prevention beforehand. But this is one of the things that we do extremely well. I want to finish with this will to recover, which is how much you care and come back. It's very personal for me right now with what's happening with the wildfires in Pasadena. As I've worked on this over the last decade or two, I've tended to feel discouraged because the most important thing for this is community, right? And we're sort of famous for not doing community very well here in Southern California, right? The freeway culture, and we all drive by everyone else. I have been thrilled at how the community's come together in the last few months in just all sorts of big and small ways. And I feel more encouraged about how we're going to handle the earthquake than I was before this happened. But it's going to be a long road. It takes a long time. I have a little bit left in terms of what you could do about it. Do we want to take the time, or have I talked too much already? Okay, I'll give you what we do about it. Understand your own building, right? Probably most of you are homeowners. Your home is as good as the building code that was in place when it was built and the degree to which it was enforced. There's probably something you can do to make it stronger. Every time I bought a house, and we've moved around a little bit, so we've bought 4 houses in Southern California. We got in a foundation specialist. 3 times we did some work ranging from $150 to $1,500. Of course, we didn't buy the worst possible houses. Once we didn't have to do anything. You can probably get a foundation specialist to look at your house and see if you can do something more. And you get discount on your earthquake insurance if you do that. Interiors are another big part of the issue. 1/3 of the losses in Northridge were to contents, not to the structures. Right? And there's a lot you can do about this, and the government is not going to tell you to do it. We don't really want the government telling us how to hook down a bookcase in our house, but it can make a really big difference. So one of the things you could do is do a hazard hunt. We call it, secure your space. Look for the things that can fall down and look at the things you can do about it. Some of them are worth it, some of them are not. My grandmother's lovely china, I keep on a really low shelf, actually in a drawer, right? The everyday glasses that we've been using for the last 20 years, they're up on top, easy to get to, because if they get destroyed, I'll live with it, right? So make a choice. Make your own choices about what matters in your place. The other thing that we've got to think about going forward is the fact that utilities get really disrupted. Among one colleague at Caltech who his house survived up in Altadena, he still hasn't moved home because the water tank that fed his neighborhood got burned down. And he can't go back to his house till he gets water. We do see widespread disruption of water utilities and earthquakes, and it's one of the really big issues. So, they say store water. However much water you have, probably should get some more. You probably are going to need it because you can't stay without it. To figure out more about this, I'd recommend if you just search for 7 steps to earthquake safety. Putting Down Roots in Earthquake Country was a document that I actually first put together after the Northridge earthquake. There's a lot of really direct information on things you can do to make that better. But also then, plan with people around you. I once got asked by the LA Times to help them create an article on earthquake kits. And I actually refused, because I said, it's not a hurricane. You're not going to ever get any advance warning, right? You want to set it up so you can stay home, that you don't have to go. We ended up writing an article that said, forget the kids, talk to your neighbor. Because as I just said about the wildfires, that community is what's holding us together and the help that happens there. Making a neighborhood plan, making a family plan, how do you know that people are going to be okay, right? And I think that that's one of the most important things that you can do. And on the last bit about that will to recover, when you look at what happens in a disaster, we expect to have our economic activity growing with time. But when a disaster happens, we lose a lot. Things are destroyed, but also with the utilities gone, businesses shut down, we lose economic activity. And what we want to have happen is that we get it back, and that we get back to where we were before within a year or two. We did this with Northridge. There was a lot of money that came in. FEMA was extremely proactive because Clinton made a political decision that this was important to him. They were throwing money at the problem. 40% of people had earthquake insurance, so people were getting money and rebuilding, and they hire contractors and they hire subcontractors, and you get the economy going again. It doesn't have to happen that way. If you can't get things going right away, this is more sort of the Katrina model. When you couldn't get people to get back to New Orleans, things didn't get going, and they ended up going into a pretty long-term depression. Right? And if you look at the difference between the areas under these curves, you can lose a lot more money because you don't recover well than you lost in the disaster itself. And that's one thing we see over and over and over again. So if we want to be a disaster and not a catastrophe, the more we can prevent damage beforehand, the less we'll have to recover from. When you do planning, it improves the response, it improves the recoveries. You don't have to be making decisions at the time, and you don't have to take the time that leave the potential for falling over into the depression. And anything we can do to get money coming in quickly is a really, really big deal. And if we really lose federal support for disaster recovery, which is underway, it's going to affect our ability to recover from disasters, because it's historically been a very, very important part of this. So, we've gone through a big disaster recently. We all just went through the pandemic. 1/3 of restaurants in Los Angeles County went out of business because of the pandemic. We've seen the big economic disruption, and we've been able to come back from it. And the more we can learn our lessons from that, the more we'll be able to do well moving forward, because we really all are in this together, and what we're trying for is a society that continues to function after the disaster. Thank you.
Testing. Have a drink. Thank you so much, Lucy. That was fantastic. So I know people are getting restless, but we have some time for a few questions. Let me request that they are not statements, that they are truly questions, and you ask one at a time. Thank you very much. Go ahead.
Very specifically, when an earthquake happens, you talk about get under a table and hold on. But I've also heard that we should turn off the gas to the house.
Not during the shaking.
Okay. Okay, so basically as soon as it stops
When the
shaking or whatever.
shaking is going on, our biggest risk is flying objects because mostly our houses do not come down. If you try to run outside, you're putting yourself in the path of lots of those flying objects. Right? Even if your house does collapse, tables really do hold it up. So if you've got a table nearby, drop cover, hold on, because if it's on wheels, it'll roll away from you. That's really important. It's not important enough to go run into a different room. The largest preventable, the largest group of injuries we saw after Northridge were sprained ankles and broken legs from people trying to run during the earthquake. The second largest was glass embedded in the feet because of people who jumped up and ran through and didn't bother to put on shoes because they were in bed and ran through the glass. So you don't want to go anywhere. If you're in bed, stay in bed, but have spent the time to make sure that you don't have a big bookcase that will fall on your bed and you haven't put your bed right under a big window or if you do, film the window so it doesn't come on you. So and then, yes, if there's, turning off the gas means you're going to have a hard time getting it back, but in general, it's a good idea. Fire following earthquake is huge. It can double the losses. We've seen whenever you've got a big urban earthquake, it's a really big issue. 60% of the fires that have followed earthquakes in California in the last 50 years, 60% were electrical in nature. 25% were gas, and the rest were various combinations of things. But so being very careful, especially if the electricity's out, and then you leave your home, and then the electricity comes back, and the broken lamp that's now sitting in your sofa, that was the source of several of the fires. So being really careful about any electrical equipment that is there after when the electricity's out, and unplugging everything before you left the home would be a really smart thing to do.
Other questions? Okay,
You didn't mention anything during your talk about the problem with ground liquefaction. And I'm wondering...
I probably should have for this crew. You guys have sand.
I'm just sort of wondering what sort of construction techniques are available to mitigate that problem.
So ground liquefaction is when you have a loose soil, you shake it, it compresses, just like shaking a canister of flour. But if you now have a high water table, so there's water and it compresses, you're now compressing the water. The water will flow away, but it can't do it during the time of the earthquake. So during the earthquake, you get an increase in water pressure. And the definition of quicksand is where you have the water pressure exceeding the weight of the sand. And essentially, you get a temporary quicksand. And it acts as a quicksand, which does a really bad job of holding up buildings until the water can flow out. And in California, the good news is we've so depleted our groundwater tables that we've greatly reduced the risk in a lot of regions. But here along the coast is where you always, you just have a high water table. You can mitigate it. It's pretty expensive. You're usually talking about pilings going down into, somewhere deep enough, or maybe floating pilings that can then keep it up. Yeah, Bruce is actually a better expert on this than I am, but it's he's trying to hide too. Get an engineer, don't take it from me, but they are pretty expensive, and it's not. I've never heard of it being done on like a single family home, but it would be interesting to know what pilings you have under Fashion Island.
Okay, next question. Go ahead.
I have a question about communication. We hope if there is an earthquake, we'll all be at home in bed maybe.
Yes.
If you're not at home, most of us don't have landlines anymore. What is the best means of communication?
Okay.
Will the wireless phones be working, texting?
All right, this is actually I should have brought this up. You're right. Texting, all right.
Thank you.
How well the cell phone towers will work is a bit of a question. Big earthquake in China in 2008, they were definitely using the same standards, at least officially, that we were, what we are for cell phone towers, and they saw a massive loss of cell phone towers near the fault. So in the strongest shaking, because our cell towers are built to the same standards as our buildings, crawl out alive. I don't know who they think is living in a cell phone tower. Actually, the city of Los Angeles 10 years ago changed it so that they have to be built to an emergency services standard, try to make it sure it's usable. But that's only for new going forward. So generally, really biggest earthquakes, we're probably losing a bunch of cell towers. More likely, the system's going to be okay, but it'll be overloaded, right? We don't handle, it doesn't handle rush hour. I don't know about you, but I keep on going to voicemail whenever it's like 4 p.m., right? Because there's just not enough bandwidth. Everybody trying to call, there will be no bandwidth. And so chances are you will not be able to get a signal. However, texting takes much, much less bandwidth. It's, just a few bits, and you don't have to get it immediately. It can wait until it finds a hole in the signal and can send it on through. So texting works where cell calls don't. Well, anything like WhatsApp is a data usage, and then you're needing a lot of bandwidth again, right? Texting is the minimum bandwidth way of doing it, right? The other part, though, is almost no cell towers, maybe none at all, have more than 8 hours of backup power, and most of them don't have more than 4 hours of backup power. In Los Angeles, where I looked at it in detail, it was like 80 or 90% were 4 hours, the rest were 8 hours. We looked at making it be 2 days, and it would require a generator, and nobody wanted to talk about having generators at cell phone towers in their neighborhood. So basically, you've got 4 hours to do your communication. That's what your plan should be. When I said make a plan with your neighbors, do it. We actually have, call it text, don't talk. And the plan is to get communications happening within that 4 hours. Come up with a way in which you can tell how everybody you need to know about that they're okay or what their condition is within 4 hours. So I've helped some churches set up plans that doing that, to check in for the whole congregation. And the goal is to get it in under 2 hours, but definitely 4 because you're going to lose the power.
Okay, we'll take 2 more. Go ahead.
So AI and machine learning have been used to develop a lot of predictive models for the last few years. And I don't know if maybe you don't have enough data points, but are predictive models being developed?
They're trying. The thing is to get it to work, there has to be an actual signal. And I just gave you all the reasons that I don't think a signal exists. So far, they haven't come up with anything. And my guess would be they won't, because it is inherently random when the time of the biggest earthquakes happen. Because if the magnitude is determined dynamically during the earthquake, anything that happens before the earthquake that could be used as a signal happens before all earthquakes. And so that's the key. That physics question, what controls the magnitude of the earthquake, is the key issue. But my guess would be, my personal interpretation at this point, while acknowledging I could be wrong, is that there is nothing for the AI to find.
Okay, thank you. Final question. Everyone back their mouths.
So you know where the faults are. What can that tell us about our tsunami risk?
We have one of the lowest tsunami risks on the Pacific Basin. Right? For a couple of reasons. One is that to create a big tsunami, you need to move a huge amount of water, which basically means you need to have a subduction zone, like they have in Japan or Alaska or the Pacific Northwest. We have a few faults. Generating a tsunami requires changing the shape of the seafloor. You've got to push it up, that pushes the water out of the way. You got to move a lot of water, right? So the faults we have offshore, a chunk of them are strike slip, so you don't move much. The thrust faults we have don't tend to be that long. And so we have the potential for some minor tsunamis, and we could also trigger a landslide offshore. We think about 8,000 years ago, there was a landslide off of Long Beach that created the decent tsunami in Long Beach, but it didn't get past Long Beach. Right? So the sort of more constrained sort of thing is possible, but quite unlikely. The Pacific Basin, of course, has all these other really big faults, and you've got the tsunami in Japan was damaging all these boats in Santa Cruz, right? We actually, when I was in the U.S. Geological Survey, we did this big model of the earthquake, the shakeout. We also did a tsunami scenario. The worst case for California is a big earthquake off the Alaskan Arc, like 1964. So what we did is we took the Tohoku earthquake, which created the biggest tsunami we've ever seen, and we put it in Alaska, and then looked at what it did. Right? We did inundate Balboa Island. Sorry, you guys are really low. So abandon your car and walk out. You got plenty of time. You got 4 hours. You're just probably going to have such a traffic jam you can't get all the cars out over those 2 bridges. Right? But in general, and like the port of Los Angeles, I mean, we only were getting like 2-meter tsunamis. I mean, for those, I can remember the one in around the marina. We didn't even make it to Lincoln Boulevard, right? The tsunami we have a lot of cliffs. If you've got a cliff, you've immediately eliminated any tsunami risk because this is just a temporary rise in sea level, right? And we have about 4 hours warning from an Alaskan tsunami before the waves get here. What we do see as a big damage is currents. The water moves around in the harbor. We did a $10 billion in damage to boats along the coast of California. It was something like that. But it was floating piers that float off of their pilings, and then the currents in the harbor throwing the boats around. There was a lot of damage from that, but I suppose if you're on a boat, get out to sea, because then it doesn't matter so much.
Okay, thank you very much. And thank you very much. So I want to remind everybody, well, first of all, thank you for attending. We will be taking a summer recess, and we'll see you again in the fall, probably in October, where we'll resume the Spotlight and the other great programs here. We do, again, encourage you to help us finish the hall so that we're in a new hall next year. And please join us for coffee and cookies outside. Thank you all for a great evening.